Do you really think you can tell me no? Harrison Wellington's words cut through the diner like steel. Destiny Johnson didn't flinch. She placed her hands firmly on the counter, staring at him without a hint of fear. I said no, she replied, voice steady, almost too calm for the storm that hung in the room. Around them, the diners froze. Forks paused mid-air, coffee cups trembled in hesitant hands, and eyes darted between the two figures locked in this unspoken duel. Ruby, the diner's owner, clutched her apron, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Destiny, please, just do what he says, she whispered. But Destiny shook her head slightly, her eyes scanning every inch of the room, measuring every possible risk, calculating the cost of standing her ground. Harrison took a step closer. You think your little courage changes anything? He said, the amusement in his tone as sharp as a blade. I could make this place disappear with a single call. You understand that, don't you? Destiny's jaw tightened. I understand exactly who you are, she answered, and in her tone there was no defiance, only clarity. He blinked once, as if surprised that his wealth and authority had met a wall he couldn't crush. The tattoo on her shoulder caught the flickering fluorescent lights. A symbol of battles fought far from this quiet town, of courage forged in places where most would never survive. The realization hit Harrison then. Power isn't always measured in money. Sometimes it's in the willingness to face fear head-on. The tension in the room was electric. Every diner's heartbeat seemed loud, each breath synchronized with the escalating standoff. Ruby's voice broke the silence again. He'll destroy everything if you don't back down. Destiny didn't move. Then let him try. But I won't let anyone I care about get hurt while I stand by, she said. Harrison's smirk faltered slightly, and for the first time, the room saw a crack in the facade of the man used to bending everyone to his will. The moment was fragile, suspended, as if time itself waited to see who would blink first. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Destiny Johnson, really? A young woman with a past few could imagine, carrying scars of battles fought far from the safety of this quiet town. And who was Harrison Wellington? A man whose wealth could buy anything, yet whose arrogance blinded him to the idea that money couldn't always conquer courage. The diner had become the stage for a confrontation that no one in Millbrook would forget. And yet, the questions hanging over the room were far bigger than spilled coffee or torn uniforms. Why was Harrison so determined to intimidate Ruby's diner into submission? Was it just about the property, the corner of the street he coveted for luxury development? Or was there something personal buried under decades of inherited pride and control? And Destiny? Why had she returned to this town after leaving so suddenly years ago? What had driven her to stand between Ruby and a man whose influence could destroy everything in a heartbeat? Every diner patron sensed it. The answers were not simple. Some glanced nervously at the door, wondering if Harrison's threats would escalate, while others watched Destiny with admiration, sensing the weight of her history without knowing the details. Harrison paced slightly, adjusting his cufflinks, and muttered under his breath, You think you can protect her? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Destiny's gaze didn't waver. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, she replied quietly, but her eyes told of a past shaped by far more dangerous encounters, and of a resolve forged in fire. The stakes were clear. Every action here could tip the balance. Every word, every gesture could ignite a chain of events no one could stop. Who would blink first? Who would be forced to surrender? And at what cost? And beyond the walls of the diner, in the quiet streets of Millbrook, the town itself seemed to hold its breath, watching to see whether the arrogance of inherited wealth would crush courage, or if a single act of defiance could alter the trajectory of everyone involved. The questions mounted. Could one young woman really stand against a man whose empire touched every corner of the town? And if she did, what would the consequences be for Ruby, for the diners, for anyone who dared witness this unfolding battle. Harrison's next move was unpredictable, yet there was a pattern to his threats, a precision, a cold logic honed by a lifetime of privilege. Destiny, however, carried with her a different kind of precision, one born of necessity, survival, and loyalty. And so, as the diner fell silent, each person inside became part of a story far larger than themselves. Every glance, every twitch, every word spoken could shift the outcome. The central mystery loomed over them. Who would control the course of the evening, and at what cost? And for the viewers at home, watching from miles away, the tension mirrored their curiosity. What happens when power meets principle, when wealth meets unwavering courage, and when the past collides with the present in a small town that thought it had seen it all? Destiny Johnson was a woman defined by the duality of her life. The small-town girl who once walked Millbrook streets with unguarded curiosity, and the disciplined soldier who had seen horrors most could scarcely imagine. She had grown up under the watchful eye of Ruby Patterson, the matriarch of the diner that had long served as a cornerstone of the community. From the moment she could walk, Destiny had been familiar with the scent of freshly baked biscuits, the sound of coffee brewing, and the soft hum of conversation punctuated by laughter or gentle reprimands. Ruby had been more than a mentor. She had been the figure of guidance and stability when her own family life had felt uncertain, a constant presence who taught her lessons that went far beyond the tasks of clearing tables or serving meals. "Keep your head high, Destiny," Ruby would often say, her voice carrying authority softened by warmth. "The world will test you, but your integrity will define you more than your fears ever could." Those words, once easy to hear and nod along to, would later reverberate through Destiny's consciousness in ways she could never have anticipated. Every small lesson, every story shared over a steaming plate of home-cooked food, had layered a foundation of resilience, loyalty, and empathy that would later shape the way she faced the most harrowing situations of her adult life. Her departure from Millbrook had been abrupt, sudden, and for reasons she barely disclosed even to herself. Destiny had left for the army under the guise of a family emergency, a story that had shielded the truth from her closest companions. In reality, the pull of duty, the desire to test herself against a world far larger and far more dangerous than the confines of Millbrook, had been irresistible. The army became both her proving ground and her crucible. In Afghanistan, she had learned the unforgiving nature of human conflict, the fine line between survival and sacrifice, and the unyielding discipline required to navigate a landscape defined by danger and uncertainty. She had carried herself through firefights, ambushes, and the unrelenting mental strain of constant vigilance, each experience carving a deeper understanding of courage, strategy, and moral conviction into her being. Yet despite medals and commendations, honors that would earn respect in any ordinary setting, Destiny remained restless. The life she had known before, the warmth of familiar streets, and the safety of a community that had nurtured her, haunted her nights and whispered to her in moments of quiet. The distance between the disciplined soldier she had become and the girl who had once taken tips with shaky hands at Ruby's counter was a gulf she could not bridge with medals alone. Harrison Wellington's upbringing had been defined by an entirely different set of circumstances. Born into wealth, privilege, and legacy, he had never known hardship in the way Destiny had. Power and money were constants, inherited and leveraged with precision. His family's influence threaded through the very fabric of Millbrook, reaching the banks, the newspapers, and the construction companies that reshaped the town at will. To him, life was a series of calculations, transactions, and dominion. People were either assets or obstacles, and the world had been designed to yield to his control. Yet, when he encountered Destiny and her presence in Ruby's diner, he sensed an anomaly, an unpredictable element that refused to bend. "She's different," he had remarked quietly to his assistant, a rare trace of intrigue entering his usually impervious demeanor. "Most people crumble. She doesn't even flinch." That singular spark of defiance, however quiet, was enough to disrupt the rhythm he had maintained all his life, to awaken a need for control he had never truly challenged before. Harrison was accustomed to victory, to immediate compliance. A single person standing firmly against him was a complication he could neither ignore nor casually dismiss. Ruby Patterson herself embodied the endurance of Millbrook's older generations. For decades, she had defended her diner against change, competition, and neglect, maintaining it as a space where people found nourishment, familiarity, and community. Her life was an accumulation of small victories, late nights, early mornings, and the unspoken love of a town that had watched her family grow. Yet the arrival of Harrison Wellington's pressure, with his offers, his threats, and his carefully calculated power, introduced an unprecedented strain. Her eyes, lined with years of effort and worry, reflected the weight of responsibility not only for herself, but for the customers who relied on her, the employees she cared for, and the history embedded in every brick and table of the diner. Each interaction with Harrison, every gaze exchanged, carried a tension that spoke of history, experience, and stakes that transcended a simple business dispute. The collision of destiny in Harrison and Millbrook was not merely a confrontation between two individuals. It was a clash of worlds. On one side stood a woman forged by adversity, guided by principle, and driven by loyalty. On the other, a man molded by entitlement, privilege, and an unchallenged sense of dominion. Their histories, though separate, converged in that diner, each action weighted with the invisible threads of past experiences, choices, and expectations. The stage was set for an encounter that would test courage, morality, and the capacity to navigate the complex interplay of power, loyalty, and justice. The tension that hung in the air was not just personal. It carried the echoes of every person who had witnessed, suffered, or resisted oppression in one form or another. The morning had arrived with a deceptive calm, the sun spilling golden light across Millbrook streets, painting a picture of serenity that could not have been further from the reality waiting inside Ruby's diner. Destiny Johnson approached the building with a sense of purpose that made each step feel heavier, burdened with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The doors, worn and familiar, creaked under her hand as she entered, revealing the interior that had been a sanctuary for decades. Broken windows, the remnants of vandalism, and the faint odor of spilled coffee told a story of recent chaos. The scene seemed mundane at first glance, but Destiny could read it like a map, tracing patterns of intimidation and control. Every detail, the placement of the overturned chairs, the calculated scuff marks near the cash register, spoke of someone who had spent time planning not merely to disrupt, but to dominate. It was impossible to mistake the intent. This was a calculated challenge, a test of resilience aimed squarely at Ruby, and now, Destiny, by extension. The arrival of Harrison Wellington was almost cinematic in its precision. The black Porsche glided to a stop outside, reflecting sunlight from its polished surface, and the door opened to reveal a man who carried confidence like armor. His stride toward the diner was measured, deliberate, designed to project control and dominance. There was a rhythm to his movement, a repetition of gestures honed over years of unchallenged power, and yet Destiny could sense a fissure in the surface of that confidence, a trace of impatience, a slight narrowing of the eyes that betrayed recognition of resistance. He entered the diner with a calm that demanded attention, a presence that immediately altered the energy of the room. Patrons froze mid-bite, hands gripping coffee cups and utensils with a tension that was almost visible. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with anticipation and the unspoken fear of what was to come. Harrison's gaze swept the room, lingering on familiar faces with subtle calculation, a predator taking stock of its surroundings before the hunt. Destiny moved deliberately, her posture neutral, eyes alert, but internally every instinct screamed to anticipate every possible action. She had been trained for chaos, for the unpredictable violence of combat zones, yet this situation presented a different kind of threat, one defined not by bullets, but by intimidation, manipulation, and control. Harrison approached the counter, his attention fixed on the pattern of authority that Ruby had maintained for years. The man spoke, measured, calm, but the words carried weight that could crush anyone unprepared. Offers, subtle threats, insinuations about financial stability and legal recourse were laid bare in a way that tested every boundary Ruby had established. Destiny observed each nuance, noting the shifts in body language, the way patrons stiffened, the almost imperceptible tremor in Ruby's hands. Every micro-reaction was a data point, a clue to understanding the full scope of what Harrison intended to accomplish. The tension escalated as Harrison moved through the diner with purpose. He placed himself in positions that forced attention, occupied spaces that minimized mobility, and maintained a gaze that communicated both calculation and authority. Destiny, aware of the psychological manipulation at play, understood the stakes. A single misstep could result in disaster not just for her but for Ruby, the diner, and everyone who had come to rely on this space as a refuge. The atmosphere was suffocating, every motion weighted with meaning. Harrison's hand on the table, his deliberate movements, the faint tightening of his jaw, all signaled a man accustomed to unchallenged dominance and the rare frustration of encountering defiance. It was then that the subtle clash began, not with violence immediately, but with assertion. Destiny's calm, deliberate responses to Harrison's provocations created a friction that was almost imperceptible to anyone untrained in reading human intent. Yet the effect was unmistakable. Harrison's controlled demeanor began to flicker, revealing the cracks beneath the surface. Each measured step Destiny took, each precise action in response to Harrison's calculated intimidation, amplified the tension. The diner became a stage, with every patron and employee unwittingly a witness to a contest of wills. The ordinary became extraordinary. Serving coffee, straightening chairs, and maintaining composure became acts of defiance, subtle yet profound. Minutes stretched, heavy with anticipation, as Harrison's efforts to assert control met the quiet resistance of Destiny's resolve. He escalated, placing demands that seemed innocuous but were weighted with implicit threats, testing boundaries and patience. Every command, every suggestion, carried with it the threat of ruin, should compliance not be immediate. Yet Destiny remained a constant, a fulcrum of stability and calculated restraint. The tension reached a breaking point not with the raising of a hand or the shouting of a word, but in the silent standoff, the charged presence of two forces, one born of relentless discipline and loyalty, the other forged from inherited power and expectation. Neither would yield, and the diner itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the outcome. The moment crystallized into a tableau of conflict. Destiny, steadfast and deliberate, upholding the dignity of Ruby and the integrity of the diner. Harrison, poised, calculating, wielding power with a precision honed by years of entitlement and practice. Every eye in the room followed, every subtle movement analyzed, as the invisible battle unfolded with intensity that transcended spoken words. Patrons, once passive, became silent witnesses to a struggle defined not by physical blows, but by courage, morality, and unspoken understanding of what was truly at stake. It was a confrontation where the outcome was uncertain, where history, loyalty, and principle hung in the balance, and where the resolution would define not just the individuals present, but the legacy of the space they occupied. The diner had fallen silent in the wake of the confrontation, each individual processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Destiny remained at her station, mop in hand, her movements methodical, precise, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to dominate. Outside, the streets of Millbrook carried on their routine rhythm. But for the small group inside, time had shifted, stretched into a moment that would define what came next. News of Harrison Wellington's presence and the encounter at Ruby's diner began to ripple outward, carried initially by whispered conversations, then by phone calls, and eventually by the local news cycle, a slow but inevitable cascade of attention that transformed a private act into a public spectacle. For many in the town, The story was almost unbelievable. The kind of event that would be retold in fragments and exaggerations, yet every detail had been etched into the memory of those who bore witness. Within hours, investigators had begun to arrive, though their understanding of the events was limited. Reports were filed, statements were taken, but the gap between perception and reality widened with each retelling. The authorities, accustomed to routine incidents, struggled to contextualize the confrontation between a wealthy, influential businessman and a young woman in a uniform apron who had stood unflinching in the face of intimidation. The weight of public opinion and social pressure began to shape the narrative almost as strongly as the facts themselves. Local residents, largely older and deeply familiar with Ruby and her diner, became unofficial chroniclers, recounting their perspectives and emphasizing the courage they had observed, even as they debated the potential consequences for those involved. Investigators noted the careful placement of evidence, the deliberate gestures of those in the diner, and the psychological interplay that had unfolded in plain sight. Every detail, from the precise location of a coffee cup to the sequence of movements across the floor, became a puzzle piece in reconstructing the incident. Experts in human behavior and threat assessment would later analyze the events and conclude that the confrontation was as much about asserting dominance as it was about testing boundaries, a subtle display of power meant to intimidate, manipulate, and control. Yet within the careful orchestration, there existed an unpredictability born of Destiny's discipline, her understanding of human psychology, and her ability to remain composed under extreme pressure. Her actions challenged assumptions about compliance, authority, and vulnerability, and they forced observers to reconsider the dynamics of influence in spaces where power was exercised without restraint. Media attention began to mount. Local news outlets, online forums, and social media channels quickly amplified the story, creating a complex feedback loop where public opinion influenced investigative priorities and the unfolding events were influenced by the perception of the public. Headlines framed the confrontation in ways that varied widely, some emphasizing the wealth and power of Harrison Wellington, others focusing on the bravery and resilience of Destiny Johnson. Within the swirl of information, red herrings emerged, rumors proliferated, and narratives competed for attention. The true sequence of events, nuanced and intricate, risked being overshadowed by sensationalized accounts and the allure of dramatic simplification. Yet those who had been present in the diner retained a clarity born of first-hand observation, a memory of tension, intention, and subtle resistance that could not be erased or misinterpreted. Meanwhile, Harrison's team of lawyers and advisors mobilized. Meetings were held, strategies were outlined, and communications crafted to protect reputation and influence public perception. His movements, carefully timed and coordinated, revealed a man accustomed to wielding resources strategically, manipulating both narrative and circumstance to his advantage. Yet even within this network of control, cracks began to appear. The resilience of a single, disciplined individual had introduced variables that could not be fully anticipated or contained. Harrison's dominance, while formidable, faced the strain of exposure, public scrutiny, and the unexpected courage of a young woman who refused to be intimidated. Each press release, legal filing, and calculated message carried the imprint of a man seeking to reassert control, but also reflected the pressure of circumstances he had not encountered in decades of unchallenged authority. As days passed, investigators conducted detailed analyses, reviewing footage, examining witness statements, and reconstructing sequences of action. Every perspective offered insight, yet each also introduced new questions. Motives were scrutinized, psychological profiles considered, and the broader context of power dynamics in Millbrook examined. Patterns emerged, revealing not only the intent behind the confrontation, but also the social and economic tensions that framed the interaction. Residents debated ethics, loyalty, and courage. Conversations spread beyond the town, reaching those who had never stepped foot in Ruby's diner, but were captivated by the narrative of courage, confrontation, and resilience. The aftermath extended beyond immediate consequences. Destiny's actions had set in motion a chain of events that would redefine relationships, challenge perceptions of authority, and shape the course of future confrontations. Ruby's Diner remained a symbol, both of endurance in the face of intimidation and of the subtle, quiet power of standing firm. And while investigators, journalists, and the public continued to seek clarity, the essence of what had occurred was understood by those who mattered most. A story of courage measured not in volume, but in restraint. Not in aggression, but in unyielding resolve. Weeks after the confrontation, the atmosphere in Millbrook had shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Destiny Johnson had returned to her normal routine at the diner, yet everything felt different. The sense of threat that had loomed over Ruby and her customers had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed, becoming a quiet tension that lingered in the background. People whispered about Harrison Wellington with caution, their awe of his wealth tempered by a new respect for the young woman who had faced him unflinching. It was clear now that his influence, while vast, was not absolute, and for the first time, cracks were showing in his carefully constructed facade. Evidence had emerged that contradicted the narrative his team had been promoting. Small details, seemingly insignificant, began to paint a picture of his manipulations, of threats that were far more calculated than initially realized. Investigators discovered that the vandalism at Ruby's Diner had not been random, nor had it been merely juvenile mischief. Security footage from nearby buildings showed vehicles parked strategically near the diner on multiple nights, with individuals appearing briefly before disappearing, leaving behind damage and fear. Payments and phone records suggested coordination, raising the chilling possibility that the attacks had been planned well in advance, intended to coerce Ruby into submission. Yet within the same evidence, subtle missteps appeared. Communications that were intercepted, movements that were unaccounted for, timing that suggested overconfidence. Destiny had not only survived the confrontation, she had exposed weaknesses in a man who believed no one could ever challenge him. Public attention intensified as documents, messages, and witness accounts surfaced, revealing Harrison's aggressive tactics and the extent of his interference in the town. Media outlets highlighted the stark contrast between his wealth and entitlement and Destiny's courage and resourcefulness. Interviews with residents and employees painted a fuller picture of her role, not just as a witness but as an active agent who had shifted the balance of power. The narrative of victim and aggressor became more complex, showing that while money could intimidate, it could not always suppress the consequences of visible defiance. In this unfolding scenario, Harrison's carefully maintained image began to falter. Social pressure mounted, and scrutiny from both legal authorities and public opinion forced him into reactive measures rather than calculated control. The town held its collective breath as the investigation continued. The revelation of Harrison's intentions, coupled with Destiny's ability to remain composed, had changed the way people viewed power. No longer was the wealthy businessman untouchable. His influence remained, but it was now shadowed by the reality that courage, intelligence, and strategic action could disrupt even the most formidable plans. Destiny's reputation grew quietly, known to some as a protector, to others as a symbol of resistance. And while the full consequences of the revelation were still unfolding, it was evident that the confrontation had set in motion a transformation within the town, one that would alter relationships, hierarchies, and perceptions of authority in ways that could not be undone. Months had passed since the confrontation at Ruby's Diner, but the ripples of that day continued to resonate throughout Millbrook. Destiny Johnson had returned to a semblance of normal life, yet nothing could truly be the same. The town, once quiet and predictable, now carried an undercurrent of change. People who had previously feared the influence of the wealthy and powerful now whispered about a woman who had faced that power and survived, and in surviving, shifted the balance. Ruby Patterson's diner remained open, but the threat of economic pressure lingered like a shadow that refused to dissipate completely. What had seemed like a momentary victory was revealing layers of consequence that even Destiny had not anticipated. Harrison Wellington, for his part, had retreated behind his empire of wealth, Yet the veneer of control he had relied upon began to crack. Subtle errors compounded, documents misplaced, employees hesitant, and associates questioning decisions that once would have been unquestionable. It became apparent that in underestimating destiny, he had underestimated the force of resolve combined with insight. Small towns, often overlooked, had their own networks, their own mechanisms for survival, and those networks had begun to turn against him in ways that his money could not immediately remedy. Conversations he thought private were leaked, reputations that had been carefully curated began to fracture, and the perception of invincibility slowly eroded. As the days unfolded, new evidence surfaced. Emails, bank transfers, and testimonies painted a clearer picture of Harrison's orchestration of threats against Ruby's diner. But the most shocking revelation was that someone within his inner circle had quietly begun to question the morality of these tactics. A quiet rebellion had started, not out loud, not with confrontation, but through small acts of resistance and subtle disclosures. Pieces of the puzzle Destiny had never seen came together, and the scale of the manipulation became evident. What had been intended as an intimidation campaign to force submission had, in fact, exposed vulnerabilities and created an environment of scrutiny that could not be reversed. The final twist arrived with a public hearing convened by town authorities. Harrison Wellington faced questions, scrutiny, and a legal examination of actions that had previously been shielded by wealth and influence. Destiny watched from the back of the room, composed but tense, as every detail unfolded. The court transcripts, combined with eyewitness accounts and physical evidence, painted a story that no amount of money could obscure. It was not a moment of violent confrontation, but a quiet, methodical dismantling of a facade, one carefully constructed over decades, now crumbling under the weight of truth and accountability. Ruby Patterson, seated beside Destiny, felt the culmination of weeks of anxiety, fear, and determination. Her diner, her legacy, had survived not by sheer luck, but because of persistence, courage, and the intervention of someone who refused to allow injustice to prevail. The community, long subdued by the weight of wealth and status, found renewed confidence in the idea that resistance was possible. Harrison Wellington's final response was not explosive, nor did it attempt reconciliation. It was a retreat, calculated and measured, but a retreat nonetheless. The realization that power could be challenged without immediate destruction became a lesson for the town that would echo for years. In the quiet that followed the hearing, Destiny stepped outside, feeling the afternoon sun warm her face. The streets of Millbrook seemed different, smaller, and yet fuller of potential. The lesson was clear. Courage and strategic action could tip the balance even in a world dominated by wealth. Harrison Wellington remained wealthy, but the aura of untouchability had been permanently altered. The victory was not just for Destiny or Ruby. It was for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the shadow of someone else's influence. And in that quiet, reflective moment, the town began to understand that true strength was not in wealth or position, but in action, resilience, and the refusal to accept injustice. If you love the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share to people around you. See you in my next video.